Picture Germany in 1923, a nation drowning in economic chaos where hyperinflation had turned money into nothing more than colorful paper, where a simple loaf of bread could cost you 200 billion marks, where desperate families would actually throw their worthless currency into their stoves because burning money was genuinely cheaper than buying firewood to stay warm through the brutal German winters. Then came 1929, and just when people thought things couldn't get worse, the Great Depression crashed down on them like a sledgehammer, crushing what little hope remained as banks folded overnight, factories locked their gates forever. And by 1933, a staggering 6 million Germans found themselves without work, representing nearly a third of the entire workforce, with families literally starving in the streets of once prosperous cities. This was the shattered Germany that Adolf Hitler inherited when he seized power in January 1933, a nation that had been economically destroyed not once but twice in the span of barely a decade, its people traumatized, desperate, and willing to believe anyone who promised salvation. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-boggling. Just 6 short years later, in 1939, this same bankrupt nation somehow managed to invade Poland with a massive force of 3 million soldiers backed by 3,000 tanks and 4,000 aircraft, fielding what was undeniably the most modern and terrifying military machine anywhere in Europe. How on earth does a country go from economic ruin to military superpower in just 6 years? The answer involves something most people never learn about in their history classes. A scheme so audacious and so brilliantly deceptive that it fooled the entire world while secretly funding the largest military buildup in modern history. At the center of this story sits a fake company with a forgettable name, a financial wizard who understood money better than almost anyone alive, and what amounts to a national-scale Ponzi scheme that would make even the most ruthless modern fraudsters shake their heads in reluctant admiration. These were the Mefo bills, a shadow banking system that allowed Nazi Germany to fund its massive rearmament program while completely hiding it from international observers, creating invisible money that didn't show up on any official records. By 1939, when these bills started coming due, Germany discovered it didn't have anywhere near the money needed to pay them back, which meant Hitler faced a stark choice. Either watch his economy implode in spectacular fashion or invade neighboring countries to loot enough resources to keep the scheme alive. The Nazi economy wasn't built solely on ideology and propaganda, though those certainly played their parts. No, it was fundamentally built on a financial scam that required constant territorial expansion just to survive, a pyramid scheme disguised as national policy. This is the real story of how Hitler paid for World War II and why economic collapse made the war not just likely but virtually inevitable. Before we go deeper, imagine yourself in this impossible situation for just a moment. It's January 1939 and you're one of Germany's top economists, someone who understands numbers and trends better than most people understand their own families. You can see with absolute clarity that the economy is about to collapse. You know with certainty that Hitler's only solution involves plunging Europe into war, and you're faced with an impossible choice. Do you speak up knowing it will almost certainly cost you your life, or do you stay silent and let catastrophe unfold? Real people, actual human beings with families and hopes and fears, faced this exact moral dilemma. By the end of this story, you'll understand why every single option available to them was terrible. To truly grasp how desperate Germany had become, you need to understand both economic catastrophes that devastated the nation. First came the hyperinflation of 1923, and when we say hyperinflation, we're not talking about prices going up a little bit every year like we're used to. In November 1923, at the absolute peak of Weimar hyperinflation, a single American dollar was worth 4 trillion German marks, a number so absurd it barely makes sense to the human mind. Workers had to demand payment twice daily, once at lunch and again at the end of their shift, because by evening their morning wages literally couldn't buy anything anymore. Restaurants would change their prices while you were still sitting there eating your meal, with waiters climbing onto tables every half hour to shout out the new menu prices to confuse diners. Life insurance policies that families had faithfully paid into for decades, policies representing years of sacrifice and planning, would mature into sums that couldn't even purchase a single postage stamp. This wasn't just an economic crisis in the normal sense of that phrase. This was economic apocalypse, the complete destruction of everything the German middle class had worked for, with savings evaporating overnight, pensions becoming worthless, and investments turning into nothing but painful memories. Germany slowly began to recover over the next few years as the currency stabilized and life started to feel normal again. But then 1929 arrived and brought the Great Depression crashing down on a nation that hadn't fully healed from its first trauma. American banks suddenly called in their loans all at once. German businesses collapsed like dominoes, and unemployment exploded to levels that seemed impossible. By 1932, those 6 million unemployed Germans represented a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions, with families auctioning off their furniture in the street just to buy food for their children, engineers and teachers begging for any kind of work as common laborers, and the Weimar government completely paralyzed and unable to respond effectively. Political violence became constant as communist and Nazi street battles turned major cities into war zones where ordinary people feared to walk. Germany had been economically destroyed twice in just 14 years, which created the perfect environment for someone like Hitler to rise to power by promising to restore German greatness, rebuild the military, and defy the hated Treaty of Versailles. But there was one massive problem with those promises. Germany was completely bankrupt, and the Versailles Treaty strictly limited Germany to only 100,000 soldiers with no tanks, no aircraft, no submarines, and no heavy artillery, and Germany didn't have any money to build those weapons anyway, even if they were allowed to. Hitler needed to rearm massively and secretly without anyone noticing until it was far too late for them to stop him. And he needed to accomplish this miracle with an economy that had been destroyed twice in recent memory. That's where Hjalmar Schacht enters our story, the brilliant and morally flexible man who would make the impossible possible. Hjalmar Horace Greeley Schacht, born in 1877, was a banker, economist, and genuine financial genius who had already saved Germany once before. Back in 1923, when hyperinflation was destroying everything, Schacht served as currency commissioner and ended the madness by creating an entirely new currency backed by land value. And remarkably, it actually worked as the Rentenmark stabilized and Schacht became a legend in German financial circles. On March 17, 1933, Hitler appointed him president of the Reichsbank, which was Germany's central bank, and in August 1934 Schacht also became Minister of Economics, giving him incredible power over Germany's financial system. Schacht's job was seemingly impossible. Fund massive rearmament without anyone noticing, without triggering the inflation that would terrify German citizens who remembered 1923, and without revealing the true scale of what Germany was secretly doing. Schacht was brilliant enough to see a solution where others saw only impossible contradictions, and he definitely had a plan. Here's the challenge Hitler faced in simple terms. Germany needed to build thousands of tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons, which meant paying steel companies, arms manufacturers, and chemical plants enormous sums of money. But if the Reichsbank just printed money to pay these companies, two catastrophic things would happen almost immediately. First, inflation would explode again, and Germans absolutely would not tolerate that because they had lived through the nightmare of 1923 and would rather overthrow the government than experience that horror again. Second, these massive payments would show up on official Reichsbank statements where foreign governments would see them, realize Germany was secretly rearming in violation of Versailles, and intervene before Germany was militarily ready to resist. Hitler needed invisible money, money that somehow wouldn't trigger inflation and money that wouldn't appear on any official records that foreign governments could examine. Schacht created exactly that through one of the most audacious financial schemes in modern history. In 1934, Schacht created a company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft MBH, which translates roughly to Metallurgical Research Company Limited Liability, mercifully shortened to MEFO. On paper, it looked like a legitimate research consortium where four major German companies including Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, and Goethe owned shares in MEFO, which had a nominal capitalization of only 1 million Reichsmarks total, a tiny amount that wouldn't raise any suspicions. In reality, MEFO did absolutely nothing, producing no research, manufacturing no products, employing almost no staff. It was purely a shell company with impressive letterhead and a bank account, but this fake company was about to fund the largest rearmament program in history through a scheme of breathtaking cleverness. Here's exactly how the scheme worked in practice. Imagine you're a German arms manufacturer in 1935 and the government orders 1,000 tanks from you, except instead of paying you in regular Reichsmarks, they pay you in something called MEFO bills. These bills are essentially IOUs, promissory notes issued by this MEFO company that basically say MEFO promises to pay you this amount in 5 years with interest. Now, obviously, you don't want to wait 5 years because you need cash immediately to pay your workers and buy the steel and other materials needed to manufacture those tanks. So you take these MEFO bills to a private German bank. Any regular commercial bank will do. The bank examines the bills carefully and they know something crucial. MEFO is secretly backed by the Reichsbank itself, and they know the Reichsbank will absolutely honor these bills when they come due. So the bank gives you cash, real Reichsmarks you can spend immediately, maybe at a small discount to account for the time value of money, but you walk out with actual cash in hand. You're happy because you got paid and can fulfill the government contract. Here's where the absolute magic of the scheme reveals itself. That private bank now holds these MEFO bills as assets on its books, and they take them to the Reichsbank, which converts them to cash using its money-issuing powers. But here's the absolutely critical part that makes this whole scheme work. These transactions never show up on the official Reichsbank balance sheet that foreign governments examine. MEFO bills are technically private obligations, debts of a private research company, not government debt and not Reichsbank debt. So when British or French or American financial experts look at Germany's official finances, they don't see this massive rearmament spending at all because it's completely invisible in the official records. Between 1934 and 1938, Germany issued an absolutely staggering 12 billion Reichsmarks in MEFO bills. And to put that in proper context, Germany's entire national debt in 1932 was only about 10 billion Reichsmarks total. Germany had secretly added more than its total existing debt in completely hidden obligations specifically to fund rearmament, and nobody outside Germany knew the full scale until it was far too late to stop it peacefully. By 1936, Germany had brazenly violated every single military restriction imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, possessing tanks, aircraft, submarines, and a modern army that grew larger every month. The Allies didn't intervene effectively because they genuinely didn't realize how far the rearmament had progressed. And by the time they understood the full picture, Germany was already too strong to confront without risking major war. But there was one massive catch that would ultimately doom this entire scheme. Those MEFO bills had a maturity date. They came due in 5 years exactly. The first bills were issued in 1934, which meant they would mature in 1939, and Germany absolutely did not have 12 billion Reichsmarks sitting around to pay them back when they came due. The clock was ticking toward economic catastrophe, and that's when the comparison to a Ponzi scheme becomes not just accurate but unavoidable. A classic Ponzi scheme works on a simple principle. You promise investors incredibly high returns on their money. You pay the early investors using money from new investors rather than from actual profits. And the scheme works perfectly as long as new money keeps flowing and faster than old obligations come due. But eventually you always run out of new investors and the entire scheme collapses spectacularly with everyone losing their money. Nazi Germany's economy worked on exactly the same principle in practice. MEFO bills were promises to pay later using money that Germany hoped to generate through future economic growth. But by 1938, it became painfully clear that Germany's economy simply couldn't generate enough legitimate revenue to pay back those bills when they came due. The scheme desperately needed massive injections of new money, but where exactly do you get 12 billion Reichsmarks when your economy can't produce it through normal economic activity? The answer was brutally simple. You take it from someone else by force. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in what they called the Anschluss, and Austria had significant gold reserves, foreign currency holdings, and valuable industrial assets. Germany seized absolutely all of it and used those resources to prop up its failing economy. In September 1938 came the Munich Agreement, where Germany took the Sudetenland region from Czechoslovakia, and in March 1939 Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia entirely. Czechoslovakia possessed substantial gold reserves and the Skoda Works, one of the most advanced weapons factories in all of Europe, and Germany seized every bit of it. Then in September 1939 Germany invaded Poland, which had agricultural production, natural resources, and millions of people who could be enslaved and forced into labor, and Germany seized all of that too. The Nazi economy wasn't just immoral in its ideology, it was structurally designed to require conquest. As one historian memorably put it, they had to invade countries just to keep the economic scheme from collapsing. Hjalmar Schacht saw this disaster coming from miles away. By 1937 he was actively warning Hitler that the economy was dangerously overheating, that the spending was completely unsustainable, that they were heading for certain collapse, but Hitler ignored him completely because acknowledging the problem meant giving up on his grand ambitions. On January 7, 1939, just weeks before the first MEFO bills would come due and require actual payment, Schacht submitted a desperate report from the Reichsbank directors urging drastic curtailment of rearmament spending, reduction of government expenditures, and a balanced budget as the only possible method of preventing catastrophic inflation. Hitler's response came on January 20, 1939, when he simply fired Schacht as Reichsbank president. Schacht had built the machine that funded Nazi rearmament, but he'd also built in a time bomb, and Hitler's solution was to keep that bomb from exploding by constantly feeding it with new conquests, feeding it with Austria and Czechoslovakia and Poland and eventually France and the Soviet Union and everywhere else German armies could reach. The war wasn't purely Hitler's ideology driving events, though ideology certainly mattered. It was economic necessity that made war virtually inevitable, because by 1939 Germany faced only two realistic choices: either experience complete economic collapse or continue expanding through military conquest. Hitler chose expansion because the alternative meant the end of his regime. But MEFO bills weren't the only revenue stream keeping the Nazi war machine running, and the other sources were even darker and more morally reprehensible. When Germany conquered a country, they didn't just take military control and install a puppet government. They systematically looted everything of value they could find, including gold reserves, foreign currency, art collections, industrial equipment, and raw materials. In France, Germany imposed so-called occupation costs, where France was forced to pay Germany 400 million francs per day, which meant France was literally paying Germany for the privilege of being occupied by German soldiers. In the Soviet Union, Germany planned to extract grain, oil, and minerals on a massive scale to feed the German war machine, with the entire economic model being fundamentally parasitic and unsustainable. Then there's the horror of slave labor, which represented both evil and economic exploitation on an almost unimaginable scale. Concentration camp prisoners were used as forced labor in German factories building weapons, manufacturing parts, and mining coal until they literally worked themselves to death. Companies like IG Farben and Siemens deliberately used slave labor from concentration camps, working prisoners until they died, and then simply replacing them with fresh prisoners. The Nazi economy wasn't just funded by theft and conquest, it was built on slavery and genocide, and this wasn't somehow separate from the economic structure, but rather the economic structure of genocide itself. Here's another scam that shows just how deep the theft went even against Germany's own citizens. The Volkswagen was marketed as the people's car, with Germans told they could own an affordable car if they saved up through a program run by the Deutsche Arbeitsfront. Citizens were encouraged to pay a little each month into this savings program with the promise that eventually they'd receive their very own Volkswagen. An astounding 275 million Reichsmarks were collected from ordinary German savers who believed this promise, but here's the cruel punchline. How many civilian Volkswagens were actually delivered during the entire Third Reich? Exactly 0. The factory was immediately converted to military production to manufacture the Kübelwagen military vehicle instead of the promised civilian car, and German savers lost everything they'd paid in. They didn't receive any compensation until the 1960s, decades after the war ended. The Nazi economy didn't just steal from conquered enemies abroad, it actively stole from its own citizens at home. Here's yet another scheme that shows the breadth of Nazi economic deception. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Germany borrowed absolutely huge sums from Britain, France, and the United States, with these loans supposedly intended to help Germany pay its Versailles reparations. Germany took all this money. Then Hitler stopped paying reparations entirely in 1933 but conveniently kept all the loan money. So Germany literally used money borrowed from Britain and France to build the very army that would invade Britain and France just a few years later. And when Germany invaded France in 1940, the new Vichy collaborator government actually forgave part of the debt. Germany got free money from its future enemies who unknowingly funded their own invasion. And of course, we cannot forget the systematic confiscation of Jewish property, which represented both genocide and economic theft on a massive scale. Jewish businesses, bank accounts, homes, art collections, literally everything they owned was seized by the Nazi state, sold off, and used directly to fund the regime and its military operations. This wasn't just persecution or discrimination, it was systematic theft used to finance the government's operations. Every single aspect of Nazi economics was built on taking from others through force or fraud. So by 1939, the entire Nazi economy was running on mefo bills that couldn't be repaid, plunder from conquered territories, slave labor from concentration camps, and systematic theft from everyone including Germany's own citizens, and absolutely none of it was sustainable for even a moment. By 1939, the Nazi economy was teetering on the edge of complete collapse, with mefo bills coming due and Germany unable to pay them without plundering more countries, with the economy dangerously overheated, with inflation creeping back up despite all efforts to control it, and with shortages appearing in crucial areas. Schacht had repeatedly warned this would happen, and events proved him absolutely right, but instead of pulling back from the brink, Germany actually accelerated its aggressive policies, because pulling back meant economic collapse, mass unemployment, political crisis, and almost certainly the end of the Nazi regime. Hitler's only viable option was to keep moving forward no matter the cost. This is the part that most people simply don't understand about Nazi Germany and why the war unfolded as it did. The war wasn't just driven by ideology or Hitler's personal ambitions, though those elements certainly mattered. It was economic necessity that made expansion virtually inevitable, because the Nazi economy was deliberately designed to require constant expansion just to survive. Without ongoing conquest, the entire system would collapse immediately. Historian Adam Tooze wrote a detailed book about this called The Wages of Destruction, which examines the making and breaking of the Nazi economy, and his central thesis is absolutely clear. Nazi Germany was living on borrowed time from day one, because the economic model required constant warfare to survive. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, it wasn't purely about Lebensraum ideology or racial theories, though those provided convenient justification. It was fundamentally about securing oil from the Caucasus region, grain from Ukraine's fertile farmland, and resources needed to keep the economy from imploding. The war was the economy, and the economy was the war, two sides of the same coin. And when Germany started losing territory in 1943 and 1944, the economic model unraveled completely, because there was no more plunder available, no more resources to seize, just endless expenditure with no way to pay for it. The Nazi economy was a pyramid scheme in every meaningful sense, and like absolutely all pyramid schemes throughout history, it eventually collapsed under its own weight. So let me bring this entire story together into one clear picture. How did Hitler actually pay for World War II? The shocking answer is that he didn't, at least not in any conventional sense. Let me explain what that means. The Nazi economy was built on four fundamental pillars that all involved fraud or theft. First came creative accounting, where mefo bills allowed Germany to hide 12 billion Reichsmarks in debt completely off the official books, enabling them to rearm in secret and build a terrifying war machine while the rest of the world thought Germany was still recovering economically. Hjalmar Schacht's genius was creating invisible money through financial manipulation, but that money was still debt that would eventually come due and require actual payment. Second came systematic plunder, where Germany funded its war effort by stealing from everyone they conquered, taking Austria's gold reserves, Czechoslovakia's weapons factories, France's occupation payments, Soviet grain, Polish labor, everything they could carry away or extract. The Nazi economy was fundamentally parasitic, requiring constant new host countries to survive. Third came the horror of slavery, where concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, and forced laborers from occupied countries were worked to death in German factories, building the very weapons used to conquer more countries and create more slaves in an endless vicious cycle. The economic model was completely inseparable from genocide. Fourth came theft in every form imaginable, including confiscation of Jewish property, defaulting on Versailles loans, canceling reparations payments, and even stealing from German savers through schemes like the Volkswagen fraud. Every single aspect of Nazi economics involved taking from others without compensation or consent. So was Nazi Germany actually a Ponzi scheme in the technical sense? Essentially yes, because early investors got paid with money taken from later investors, except the later investors were entire conquered countries and payment came through military conquest. Mefo bills came due in 1939 and Germany didn't have the money to pay them, so they invaded Poland and used the loot from Poland to fund operations in France, then used the loot from France to fund the invasion of the Soviet Union. As long as Germany kept winning and kept taking, the scheme could continue functioning, but the moment Germany stopped expanding, the entire structure collapsed. This is exactly why the war was virtually inevitable regardless of Hitler's personality or ideology. By 1939, Hitler faced only two realistic options: expand through conquest or watch the economy collapse. The Nazi economy simply wasn't built for peace and couldn't function in peacetime. It was built for war and required war to survive. And that's the real answer to how Hitler paid for World War II. With promises he couldn't keep, with money he didn't actually have, with resources he stole through conquest, with labor he enslaved through genocide. The Nazi war machine wasn't funded by economic strength or productivity. It was funded by a massive scam that required constant conquest to avoid immediate collapse. And when the conquest finally stopped, the economy died right alongside the regime. Here's the question this entire story should make you think about carefully. Knowing that the Nazi economy required constant expansion just to survive, do you think the war was truly inevitable, or could Germany somehow have pulled back and transitioned to a sustainable peacetime economy? It's a question without easy answers, because every option available to German leaders by 1939 was terrible, and real people had to make these impossible choices knowing that millions of lives hung in the balance.